Mud and mayhem, a tale of cornfields and chaos. The sun rose slow and steady over Maplewood on March 1st, 2025, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. Daniel Harper stood on the edge of his porch, boots planted firm on the weathered oak planks, a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee warming his hands. At 48, he'd spent more years coaxing life from this land than most folks had spent breathing. His farm sprawled across 80 acres of rolling hills, cornfields stretching like green oceans, a pasture dotted with cows, and a barn that creaked with every gust of wind. It wasn't much to look at if you were passing through, but to Daniel, it was everything. The quiet hum of rural life was his symphony, the rustle of cornstalks, the low moo of cattle, the rhythmic cluck of hens settling into their nests. This was his peace, hard-earned and fiercely guarded. Rusty, his shaggy brown mutt, sprawled beside him, one ear flopped over as he snored softly. The dog had been with Daniel for a decade, a loyal shadow through muddy fields and long winters. A rooster crowed in the distance, sharp and proud, and Daniel took a sip of his coffee, letting the bitter warmth settle in his chest. Mornings like this were why he stayed, why he'd never traded the dirt under his nails for a desk job or city lights. But that peace, he'd learned 2 weeks ago, could shatter faster than a dropped egg. Her name was Melissa Grayson, and she'd rolled into town like a storm cloud with a designer purse. She'd rented the old Miller place, a squat little house half a mile down the dirt road, its white paint peeling and its porch sagging under years of neglect. Daniel hadn't thought much of it when the for rent sign came down. New folks came and went in Maplewood, retirees chasing quiet, drifters passing through. He figured she'd be no different. Then she'd shown up at his gate the day after moving in, arms crossed, lips pursed, and a pair of sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. "Your cows stink," she'd said. No hello, no preamble, just those 3 words spat out like they'd been festering all morning. She was mid-40s, maybe, with a flowery dress that looked straight out of a catalog and white sneakers so clean they glowed against the dusty road. Her hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and her nails were painted a shade of pink that didn't belong within 10 miles of a manure pile. Daniel had blinked at her, leaning on his pitchfork. "They're cows," he'd said simply. "That's what they do." She'd huffed, adjusting her sunglasses. "Well, it's wafting downwind, and it's unbearable. I can't even open my windows. You need to do something about it." He'd scratched his beard, glancing at the pasture where his herd grazed, oblivious to her plight. "Been here 20 years. Wind's been blowing the same way the whole time. You might want to talk to Mother Nature about that one." Her eyes had narrowed, but she'd pressed on. "And your roosters, they crow at ungodly hours. I'm trying to sleep, and it's like living next to a foghorn." "They're roosters," he'd said again, slower this time, like he was teaching a kid the alphabet. "They crow when the sun comes up. Keeps the farm on schedule." She'd thrown her hands up, exasperated. "This is ridiculous. I moved here for peace and quiet, not a barnyard soundtrack." "Then maybe a farm town wasn't the best pick," he'd replied, turning back to his work. She'd stormed off, muttering about country bumpkins, and Daniel had figured that was the end of it. He was wrong. The next day, she'd called the sheriff, Sheriff James Carter, a man who'd seen every kind of nonsense Maplewood could throw at him, and then some. She'd claimed Daniel's cows were staring at her funny when she jogged past, like they were plotting something. James had shown up at Daniel's door, hat in hand, a weary grin tugging at his lips. "She says your cows are harassing her," James had said, scratching the back of his neck. "I told her cows don't got much in the way of motives, but she's insistent." Daniel had laughed so hard he'd nearly spilled his coffee. Harassing her? "They're chewing cud, not casing her joint." I know, James had said, shaking his head. "Just keep Em on your side of the fence, and maybe she'll calm down." Fat chance. The complaints kept coming, each one more absurd than the last. The tractor was too loud. The barn smelled like a medieval dungeon. The dirt road kicked up too much dust when he drove his pickup. Daniel started keeping a mental tally, half amused, half annoyed. Melissa Grayson was a city woman through and through. Maplewood was just a backdrop for her Instagram life, not a place with rules older than her GPS app. But her biggest gripe, the one she saved for her grand finale, came on day 10. She'd marched up to his porch again, this time in jogging gear, leggings, a tank top, those same blinding sneakers. Your farm, she'd said, jabbing a finger at the fields, is inconveniently placed. Daniel had paused mid-sip, lowering his mug. Come again. It's right along my jogging route, she'd said, hands on her hips. I have to detour around your stupid fences, and it's throwing off my pace. Can't you move it? He'd stared at her, letting the words sink in. Move it. Move his farm. 80 acres of land his granddaddy had plowed, his daddy had tended, and he'd poured his life into. Move it because her jogging app didn't like the layout. He'd set his mug down, slow and deliberate, and leaned forward. Melissa, he'd said, voice low, this farm's been here since before you were born. It ain't moving. You want to jog, pick a new route. She'd glared, cheeks flushing red. You're impossible, she'd snapped, then spun on her heel and stomped off, leaving a cloud of dust in her wake. Daniel had watched her go, shaking his head. Rusty let out a lazy bark, like he was agreeing she was trouble. That had been 4 days ago, and Daniel had hoped she'd finally gotten the hint. He'd gone back to his routine, feeding the chickens, checking the corn, fixing a leak in the barn roof. Life settled back into its rhythm, or so he thought. But as he stood on his porch that March morning, coffee steaming in the cool air, he had no idea the real storm was about to hit. Melissa Grayson wasn't done with him yet, not by a long shot. And when she came barreling back into his life, she'd bring chaos that'd make her cow complaints look like a Sunday picnic. March 6th, 2025, dawned crisp and clear, the kind of morning that made Daniel Harper glad he'd never left Maplewood. He stepped outside at 6:45 a.m., coffee in hand, the steam curling up into the chilly air. The cornfields glowed under the rising sun, each stalk standing tall after months of care. He'd been up since 5, checking the irrigation lines and tossing hay to the cows, but now was his reward, 10 minutes of quiet before the day kicked into gear. Rusty padded after him, flopping onto the porch with a contented sigh. Daniel leaned against the railing, sipping his brew, letting the world wake up around him. Then came the noise. It started faint, a distant whine like a mosquito buzzing too close to your ear. Daniel frowned, tilting his head. The sound grew louder, sharper, a sputtering growl that didn't belong in his fields. Rusty perked up, ears twitching, and let out a low woof. Daniel set his mug down, squinting across the corn. Something red flashed between the stalks, weaving erratically, snapping plants in its path. Dust kicked up, and the noise turned into a full-on roar, punctuated by pops and wheezes. Then he saw her. Melissa Grayson burst into view, astride a cherry-red Vespa scooter that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a Rome cafe. Her flowery dress flapped like a flag in a hurricane, and her white sneakers, already streaked with mud, clung to the footrests as she wrestled the handlebars. The Vespa fishtailed, its back wheel spinning wildly, chewing through the soft soil. Cornstalks toppled in her wake, a trail of destruction stretching 50 yards behind her. She hit a patch of mud, and the scooter sank, tires whining as they dug deeper. Her sunglasses slipped down her nose, and she let out a scream that could have shattered glass. Help! Help! My scooter's stuck, she shrieked, flailing her arms like she was signaling a rescue plane. She spotted Daniel and jabbed a finger at him, her voice rising to a banshee wail. This is your fault. Daniel stood rooted to the porch, coffee forgotten, his jaw slack. He'd seen hogs break loose, tractors roll downhill, even a fox steal a chicken mid-daylight. But this? Melissa Grayson, the queen of complaints, tearing through his cornfield on a scooter like she was starring in some slapstick comedy? A laugh clawed its way up his throat, hot and unstoppable, but he choked it down. He rubbed his eyes, half convinced he was still dreaming, then stepped off the porch, boots crunching on the gravel. Melissa revved the engine, desperation twisting her face. The Vespa groaned, its back tires spitting mud in every direction, up her legs, across her dress, onto the once shiny fenders. She rocked back and forth, ponytail unraveling, but the scooter only sank deeper. Do something, she yelled, her voice cracking as she glared at him. Get me out of this. Daniel took his time strolling over, hands in his pockets, Rusty trotting at his heels. He stopped at the fence line, leaning against a post, and surveyed the wreckage. The Vespa was tilted at a 45-degree angle, its back wheel buried in a muddy trench. Corn stalks lay flattened, their golden tassels crushed into the dirt. Melissa stood knee-deep in the muck, her dress a patchwork of brown stains, her sneakers unrecognizable. She tried to step free and slipped, landing with a wet splat that sent Rusty's tail wagging. "You're trespassing," Daniel said, his tone even but laced with a smirk. Melissa's head snapped up, her mouth dropping open. "Trespassing? No, I'm shortcutting. Google Maps shows a road right here, so I have every right to use it." She yanked her phone from her purse, a muddy, battered thing now, and waved it at him, the screen smeared with dirt. Daniel arched an eyebrow, glancing at the carnage. "That's not a road, Melissa. That's my cornfield." "Then why does it look like a path?" she shot back, crossing her arms. Mud dripped from her elbow, plopping onto the Vespa's seat. "Because it's where my tractor drives," he said, slow and deliberate. "It's not a shortcut. It's a farm." She huffed, throwing her hands up. "Well, this is absurd. Why would you plant crops where people might drive through?" He picked up his coffee from the railing, taking a long sip. "Because it's a farm," he said again, letting the words hang. "We grow things here. Like corn, which you just turned into a racetrack." Her nostrils flared, eyes blazing. "I demand you get my scooter out of this disgusting mess right now. I have a brunch to get to." Daniel tilted his head, pretending to mull it over. "I could," he said, stretching the word, "but that depends." "On what?" she snapped, her patience fraying like wet twine. "On whether you admit cutting through my land was a dumb idea." Her lips tightened into a thin line, pride warring with reality. She looked down at the Vespa, now a muddy relic of its former glory, and gave the throttle a weak twist. The engine coughed, spitting more dirt into the air, and the tires sank another inch. "This is a nightmare," she muttered, barely audible. "This thing cost me $1,200. Should have spent some of that on a vehicle meant for roads," Daniel said, biting back a grin. She glared, her face a mask of fury. "I can't believe this. You have to help me. My husband's a lawyer, and if you don't..." He held up a hand. "Melissa, your husband doesn't own my land. And legally, you're trespassing. I could charge you for damages." Her eyes widened, the idea of accountability hitting her like a slap. "Damages? It's just some corn." "Just some corn," he repeated, feigning outrage. He stepped closer, pointing at the field. "You know how long it takes to grow this?" She hesitated, blinking. "For months." "For months," he said, nodding. "Planting, watering, weeding, fighting off bugs and drought. And you flattened a row in 20 seconds. That's talent, Melissa." She shifted, glancing at the trail of ruin, 50 yards of crushed stalks, a deep groove carved by her tires. "Okay, fine," she said, voice tight. "I may have made a slight miscalculation." "A slight miscalculation?" Daniel whistled. "That's like calling a flood a puddle. Are you going to help me or not?" she snapped, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. He sighed, setting his coffee on the fence post. "All right, let me grab my tractor." Her face lit up, relief flooding her features, until he turned toward the barn. "Wait," she shouted. "You're not using that rusty thing, are you?" He stopped, frowning. "How else we getting it out?" "You could lift it," she said, dead serious. Daniel stared. "Melissa, that scooter's 100 pounds. You want me to hoist it like a hay bale?" She nodded, expectant. He rubbed his temples, a long sigh escaping. "No tractor, huh?" "No. It'll scratch the paint." He bit his cheek, thinking. "Fine. I've got another idea." Her eyes brightened. "What is it?" He grinned, pointing to the pasture. "Daisy." "Who's Daisy?" she asked, brow furrowing. Daniel nodded toward the field, where his massive mule stood, chewing hay with lazy indifference. Melissa's face twisted in horror. "You're not serious." "Dead serious," he said, heading for Daisy's pen. "She's pulled heavier loads than your scooter." "No," she shrieked, flailing. "You're not letting that filthy animal touch my Vespa." "Then it stays stuck," he said, shrugging. She sputtered, caught between fury and defeat. Finally, she groaned, hands up. "Fine. Just get it out." Daniel smirked, grabbing Daisy's harness. This was going to be good. Daniel Harper had faced plenty of challenges on his farm. Droughts that withered crops, storms that toppled fences, a cow that once got her head stuck in a feed bucket for 3 hours. But nothing compared to the sight of Melissa Grayson, mud-streaked and fuming, watching him lead Daisy the mule toward her stranded Vespa. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cornfield, and Rusty sat by the fence, tail thumping like he knew a show was coming. Daisy was a beast in every sense, 6 feet at the shoulder, broad as a barrel, with a coat of gray-brown hair and ears that flicked like radar dishes. She'd been with Daniel for 12 years, a gift from his uncle after a tractor broke down mid-harvest. She'd hauled wagons, dragged logs, even pulled a pickup out of a ditch once. Now, she ambled forward, hooves sinking slightly into the soft earth, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Melissa's rising panic. "You're sure this won't damage it?" Melissa asked for the 5th time, hovering over Daniel's shoulder as he looped a rope around the Vespa's handlebars. Her dress was a ruin of mud and grass, her sneakers squishing with every step, but her concern was all for the scooter. "As sure as I am, this whole thing's ridiculous," Daniel replied, tying the knot tight, but loose enough to avoid snapping anything. He patted Daisy's flank, her muscles solid under his hand. "She's a pro. Relax." Melissa let out a sharp breath, crossing her arms. "This is unacceptable. I shouldn't have to endure this humiliation." Daniel chuckled, giving Daisy the signal to move. "Think of it as a life lesson." The rope pulled taut as Daisy took a step, her hooves digging in. The Vespa groaned, its frame creaking under the strain. The back wheel lifted an inch, then sank back into the mud with a wet slurp. Melissa gasped, clutching her chest like she'd seen a priceless vase shatter. "Careful. That's an imported vehicle." "You don't say," Daniel muttered, smirking. He clucked his tongue, and Daisy tugged harder. The scooter lurched forward, the tire breaking free with a sucking sound. Mud flew in a glorious arc, straight onto Melissa's face. There was a wet splat, a beat of silence, then a scream that sent crows scattering from the trees. Melissa stumbled back, arms flailing, mud dripping from her chin. Her sunglasses, already askew, were now a brown smear. "This is disgusting," she wailed, wiping at her face. "I look like I can't even say it." Daniel bit his tongue so hard, he tasted blood, fighting the laugh clawing up his chest. "Well," he said, pretending to study her, "if I had to guess, I'd say you look like someone who just learned not to ride a Vespa through a cornfield." She glared, her face a dripping mess. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "A little," he admitted, patting Daisy as she pulled the Vespa onto solid ground. The scooter was free, but it was a sorry sight, mud caked in every crevice, grass stuck to the wheels, a suspicious splatter on the seat. Melissa rushed to it, gasping in horror. "It's ruined," she cried, running her hands over the fenders. "Ruined? It's dirty," Daniel said, shrugging. "Still runs, right?" She turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Melissa let out a groan scream hybrid, her hands flying to her head. "This is your fault," she snapped, pointing at him. "Remind me how?" he asked, folding his arms. "If your farm wasn't so poorly maintained, I wouldn't have gotten stuck." He took a slow breath, counting to 5 in his head. "Melissa, if you walked into someone's house, tripped over their couch, and blamed them for putting it there, how'd that go?" "That's not the same," she sputtered. "It's exactly the same," he said, pointing at the wrecked field. "You trespassed, got stuck, and now it's my fault." Her mouth opened and closed, logic hitting her like a sluggish freight train. "This isn't over," she muttered, pulling her muddy phone from her purse. "I'm calling the sheriff." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Oh, please do." She hesitated, expecting him to back down. When he didn't, she dialed with a flourish, lifting the phone to her ear. "Yes, Sheriff? I need to report a crime." Daniel snorted, leaning against the fence. This was about to get real interesting. Sheriff James Carter's cruiser rolled up the dirt road 20 minutes later, tires crunching gravel as it stopped near Daniel's fence. James stepped out, a lanky man in his 50s with a salt and pepper mustache and a hat perpetually tilted back on his head. He'd been Maplewood's lawman for 2 decades, handling everything from lost cows to bar fights. But the scene before him made even him pause. Melissa stood in the cornfield, mud-streaked and furious, her Vespa a filthy heap beside her. Daisy munched hay nearby, oblivious, while Daniel leaned on the fence, coffee in hand, a grin tugging at his lips. James pinched the bridge of his nose. letting out a sigh that said he'd rather be anywhere else. "All right," he said, voice gravelly. "What happened?" Melissa launched into her tale, arms flailing, voice cracking with every dramatic peak. "I was following my GPS. It said there was a road here. And then I got stuck in this wasteland of dirt and vegetables. And she jabbed a finger at Daniel, refused to help until he humiliated me with that beast." She gestured at Daisy, who flicked an ear in response. Daniel waited, sipping his coffee, then pointed at the tire tracks. "She cut through my field without permission. Trespassing, plain and simple." James glanced at the evidence, the deep groove, the crushed corn, then back at Melissa. "Ma'am, is that true?" "I was following GPS," she huffed. "It said there was a road." James gave her a long, unimpressed look. "Ma'am, you're standing in a cornfield." Melissa flailed her arms. "I demand he pays for my scooter's damage." James sighed again, rubbing his temples. "Actually, ma'am, you trespassed and damaged his crop. If anything, you owe him." Her face turned beet red. "Outrageous. After all I've been through, I'm in trouble." "That's exactly what I'm saying," James said, pulling out his notepad. "Now, I'm not arresting anyone today, but I suggest you apologize, pay for the damages, and maybe rethink using a Vespa off-road." Melissa's jaw clenched, but with James watching, she had no choice. "Sorry," she muttered, barely audible. Daniel leaned in. "What was that?" "I said sorry," she snapped, her eye twitching. "Apology accepted," he said, cheerful as a lark. "Now, about that payment." She groaned, scribbling a check like it was a death sentence, and thrust it at him. James smirked, jotting down her info, and Daniel knew he'd won this round. 2 weeks later, on March 20th, the for rent sign was back up at Melissa's house. She'd vanished in the night. No goodbye, no fanfare, just a silent retreat that left Maplewood buzzing with relief. Daniel celebrated with a cookout, firing up the grill and piling tables with corn dishes, cob, bread, fritters, chowder. Neighbors laughed, swapping stories of Melissa's reign, and Old Man Murphy toasted her departure with sweet tea. "May she never find her way back," he said, sparking cheers. As Daniel bit into buttered corn, tires crunched down his road. A black SUV stopped, and a man in slacks stepped out, golf club in hand. "Is this the golf course?" he asked, frowning at the fields. Daniel sighed, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Buddy, you're in for a ride."